If that title felt like an explosion, that's because it was designed to sound like one. But explosions distract. They pull your eyes toward the noise instead of the pressure that built quietly underneath. What matters here isn't shock, it's unanimity. It's what happens when every exit closes at once. Because when 9 justices speak with one voice, the question stops being what just happened and becomes what no longer can be avoided. Hours ago, the Supreme Court didn't just rule. It aligned. No hedging, no caveats, no legal escape hatches. And alignment at that level is not an accident. It's a signal, not to Donald Trump alone, and not even primarily to his supporters, but to the system that has spent years trying to decide whether it still recognizes its own authority. The moment wasn't loud in the courtroom, it was quiet. And that's what makes it dangerous. Everyone is repeating the same surface claim as if repetition equals understanding. They say a business was punished. They say a company crossed a line. They say consequences arrived. But those explanations are comfortable. They let you believe this was discreet, contained, and finished. It wasn't. The real movement happened beneath the headline, in the logic that made the ruling inevitable, and in the silence that followed it. This wasn't about one man's balance sheet. It was about whether fraud, when committed at scale and sustained over time, is still treated as an aberration or finally acknowledged as architecture. The court answered that question without drama. They described a structure, they described intent, and then they removed it. Not fined, not corrected, removed. That distinction is everything. What's being dissolved here is not wealth, it's protection. For decades, corporate form has functioned as insulation, complexity as camouflage. The larger and more layered the enterprise, the more difficult accountability became. What the court said, without theatrics, is that complexity is no longer a defense when it is the mechanism of the offense. When deception is not incidental but operational, the structure itself becomes contraband. That is the line. And once a line like that is drawn at the highest level, it doesn't stay narrow. It doesn't care about party. It doesn't pause for elections. It waits, quietly, for the next case that fits. The unanimity matters more than the remedy. 9 justices agreed not only on outcome, but on framing. No concurring opinions, no separate explanations. In politically radioactive cases, that absence is intentional. It means no one wanted to narrow the holding. No one wanted to leave interpretive wiggle room. They wanted the reasoning to travel intact. That should unsettle anyone who has built power on opacity. Because this reasoning doesn't mention names, it describes behaviors, inflating value to secure leverage, deflating it to avoid obligation, presenting multiple realities to different institutions, and relying on fragmentation to prevent reconciliation. The court didn't treat that as cleverness. They treated it as fraud with a business license. And here's the part most people missed. The court did not frame this as punishment. They framed it as necessity, as if to say that once an organization reaches a certain threshold of systemic dishonesty, it cannot be reformed without preserving the harm. The only lawful response is termination. That is not a slap. That is a declaration that some structures forfeit the right to exist. Timing is never neutral at this level. The court controls its calendar. This could have waited. It didn't. The decision dropped as multiple Trump-related cases approach inflection points. When prosecutors are deciding whether to escalate or retreat, the message to lower courts was unambiguous. Aggressive remedies are not just permitted, they are endorsed. That recalibrates risk across the board. Prosecutors no longer have to guess how far is too far. Defense attorneys can no longer rely on the court to rescue their clients from structural consequences. The center of gravity shifted in a single morning, and the people who felt it first weren't watching cable news. They were in conference rooms, recalculating. Inside Republican leadership circles, the public defiance masks private alarm. This isn't about loyalty anymore. It's about survivability. Swing state candidates understand that defending Trump now means defending a legal posture the Supreme Court has unanimously rejected. Distancing from him invites retaliation from a base trained to see compromise as betrayal. That's not a dilemma. That's a trap. And traps create motion. Quiet conversations are already happening. Not about ideology, but about contingencies. What happens if Trump is the nominee while his business operations are being dismantled under judicial supervision? What happens to candidates forced to answer daily for an expanding legal crisis they cannot influence? These are not theoretical questions. They are logistical ones. Markets understood this immediately. The reaction wasn't panic. It was repositioning. Trump-linked assets dropped as expected. but other sectors moved in ways that tell a deeper story. Legal defense firms saw interest, security contractors saw gains, private corrections spiked. That is not a response to a single ruling. That is pricing in prolonged institutional conflict. When capital starts preparing for friction, it's because friction is coming. Not riots, not collapse, but years of contested authority, appeals, enforcement fights, compliance battles. The kind of slow grind that wears systems down not through spectacle, but through exhaustion. Warren Buffett's brief intervention cut through the noise precisely because avoided it. Rules matter most. That wasn't commentary. It was positioning. Filings show Berkshire Hathaway reduced exposure to commercial real estate weeks before this ruling became public. That's not prediction, that's recognition. He understood the logic before the headlines caught up. The court's silence speaks as loudly as its words. No justice attempted to personalize the decision. No one framed it as exceptional. That restraint is deliberate. It says this is not about Trump, it's about standards. And standards, once articulated, demand application. Trump's response will follow a familiar arc. First, denial, then delegitimization. We've already seen the opening move. The next phase targets the institution itself, not with legal argument, but with narrative erosion. When referees are portrayed as corrupt, outcomes become optional. That is how compliance decays. The next 72 hours will test that decay. Expect emergency filings. Expect attempts to stall, to stay, to reframe. Republicans will be forced to choose between affirming the court's authority or endorsing defiance. There is no middle position that holds. Compliance leads to prolonged legal warfare. Defiance forces a question no democracy wants to answer. What happens when a former president refuses to accept a Supreme Court order? That question extends far beyond one man, because the logic of this ruling doesn't stop at real estate or branding. It applies to any network that uses complexity to obscure accountability. Dark money structures, shell corporations, political fronts designed to move influence without fingerprints. Everyone operating in that space heard the same message today. The shield is thinner than it was yesterday. This moment will not be remembered for its shock value. It will be remembered for its clarity. The court did not blink. It did not hedge. It did not defer. It drew a line and stepped back. What happens next depends on whether the rest of the system chooses to step forward or pretend the line isn't there. If the headline felt like a bombshell, understand this. The real impact is quieter and longer lasting. The title points at Trump. The ruling points at everyone. And now that the standard exists, the only question left is who it reaches next. You're watching the early phase of something structural, not episodic. Pay attention to the responses, not the rhetoric. Watch who complies, who delays, and who attacks the referee. That's where the story actually moves.